Elvis Presley's 340 pounds bodyguard attacked Bruce Lee at Graceland. The King watched in 11 seconds. There is a story that circulates in the shadow spaces between documented history and legend. It lives in hushed conversations between martial arts obsessives and Elvis fans, in late-night forums where people debate what these two giants of American culture might have looked like in the same room together. It's a story that, if true, would be one of the most extraordinary moments of the entire 1970s. Two icons of their respective worlds, facing each other in a living room, one of them weighing more than twice the other, one of them carrying 20 years of hard experience and protecting one of the most famous human beings who ever lived. The story goes like this. At Graceland, the home of Elvis Presley, a 340-pound bodyguard named Red West challenged Bruce Lee to prove that his martial arts were more than showmanship. And in 11 seconds, everything Red West thought he knew about fighting was dismantled on white carpet in front of the king of rock and roll. Now, it's important to be upfront with you. The historical record does not confirm that Bruce Lee and Elvis Presley ever met in person. Bruce Lee's own brother, Robert Lee, stated in interviews that as far as he knew, Bruce never had the chance to meet Elvis. Multiple researchers who have studied both men's lives exhaustively have found no documented evidence of a meeting at Graceland, or anywhere else. Elvis reportedly tried to reach Bruce Lee in his later years, and was devastated to learn that Bruce had died before they could connect. The two icons of their era, the king of rock and roll and the king of kung fu, seem to have passed through the same cultural moment without ever occupying the same physical space. But here's what makes this story so enduring, so impossible to simply dismiss. Everything around the edges of it is absolutely, verifiably real. Elvis Presley's martial arts obsession was one of the most genuine and documented passions of his life. Red West's biography, his relationship with Elvis, his physical presence and his role as head of security, all of that is thoroughly established in the historical record. Bruce Lee's abilities, his philosophy, his understanding of how precision and technique could overcome raw physical size, all of that is real and documented in his own writings. The world that this story describes is a world that genuinely existed. The people in it were genuinely who this story says they are. So what we're going to do today is something a little different. We're going to take this legend, this story that lives between history and myth, and we're going to give it the full treatment it deserves. We're going to explore the real lives of the real people involved, understand exactly why this encounter, real or imagined, resonates so deeply. Because whether or not Red West and Bruce Lee ever actually faced each other on that white carpet, the story asks a question that is completely real and completely fascinating. What happens when brute force meets precision? What happens when the biggest man in the room confronts someone who has studied the human body like a science text? What happens when 20 years of experience tells you that size is everything, and then in 11 seconds, you find out it isn't? That question is worth sitting with. That question is the reason this legend refuses to die. The King of Graceland. Elvis Presley and his lifelong obsession with martial arts. Most people, when they picture Elvis Presley, think of the voice, the hips, the curl of the lip and the flash of rhinestones under a spotlight. They picture him at the microphone, or behind the wheel of a Cadillac, or in one of those Hollywood films where he inevitably ends up on a beach with a guitar. What most people do not picture is Elvis Presley spending hours in a GI, practicing kicks and strikes with the focused intensity of a man genuinely trying to master something difficult. But that's exactly what he did. For the better part of 2 decades. Elvis Presley's introduction to martial arts came in 1958, when he was drafted into the United States Army and stationed in Germany. He was 23 years old, already the most famous entertainer in America, and he found himself with enormous amounts of free time between his duties as a soldier. He discovered karate almost by accident, watching a demonstration, and something about it grabbed hold of him in a way that very few things in his adult life ever would. He found a German instructor named Jürgen Seidel, known in martial arts circles as the father of German karate, and he began training in earnest. He spent his leaves in Paris, where he worked with a Japanese Shotokan instructor. He was learning not for performance, not because someone told him it would look good on a poster. He was learning because he genuinely loved it. When Elvis returned to the United States after his discharge in 1960, he did not leave the martial arts behind. He was promoted to first-degree black belt under a Chito-ryu instructor named Hank Slomansky, a former Green Beret and Korean War veteran who was reportedly one of the most demanding martial arts instructors in the country at the time. The word that came back from Slomansky after Elvis tested was direct and memorable. "Your boy isn't pretty anymore, but he's a black belt." That wasn't a compliment handed out to celebrities because of who they were. It was an assessment of genuine ability. In 1960, shortly after his return from the Army, Elvis attended a demonstration at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills. On the floor that day was a Hawaiian-born martial artist named Edmund Parker, Ed Parker, who was in the early stages of building what would become one of the most influential martial arts legacies in American history. Parker was developing a system he called American Kenpo, a streamlined, pragmatic form of self-defense built for real-world application. Elvis watched Parker move and was captivated. He walked up afterward, introduced himself, reportedly quite humbly, as a man genuinely interested in learning, not as a star demanding attention, and began a friendship and student-teacher relationship that would last the rest of his life. Ed Parker became the central figure in Elvis's martial arts world. He was a lifelong friend, an instructor, and eventually one of Elvis's bodyguards during the touring years of the 1970s. He promoted Elvis multiple times, including to 6th degree black belt in 1973. Parker was unequivocal in interviews that Elvis had earned his ranks. He told Black Belt magazine that Elvis was a good black belt by any standards, and that it was not honorary, it was a reflection of genuine training and genuine ability. Parker also eventually referred Elvis to Master Kong Rhee, a Korean-born martial arts instructor in Memphis who taught a system combining elements of karate, kung fu, and taekwondo. Elvis trained under Master Rhee from 1970 to 1974, 4 years of intensive study that deepened his technical knowledge considerably. Master Rhee awarded Elvis a 7th degree black belt in 1973, and an 8th in 1974. The nickname Master Rhee gave him was Mr. Tiger. Elvis had it embroidered on his training belts. By 1974, Elvis had poured so much passion into martial arts that he attempted to fund and produce a documentary about the art form. He flew top martial artists to Memphis, organized demonstrations, brought in fighters including world middleweight full-contact champion Bill Wallace. The film was never finished. Elvis's interest drifted, as it sometimes did, but the footage that exists shows a man who moved with genuine skill and genuine understanding. Wayne Carman, who trained with Elvis and narrated the released footage years later, called Elvis an awesome martial artist with exceptionally good hands. That is not a phrase you use about a dilettante. Elvis incorporated karate into his stage performances throughout the 1970s, his concert jumpsuit actually designed to allow freedom of movement for kicks and strikes. He built a martial arts school in Memphis, the Tennessee Karate Institute. He wrote a personal oath aboard his private plane, the Lisa Marie, stressing respect for all styles and techniques, body conditioning, mental conditioning, and meditation for calming and stilling of the mind and body. He signed it Elvis Presley, 8th Dan. This was not a hobby. This was a devotion. And in 1970, at the beginning of this most intense period of study, Elvis was actively seeking out the best teachers he could find. He was 35 years old, at the absolute peak of his fame and cultural power, and still genuinely hungry to learn more. The Memphis Mafia. Brothers in Arms Graceland in 1970 was not simply a house. It was an ecosystem. Elvis Presley surrounded himself with a core group of men who served as friends, employees, protectors, and confidants simultaneously. The press had given them a nickname in the early 1960s, the Memphis Mafia, a reference to the dark suits Elvis occasionally required them to wear. The men themselves called each other simply the guys. But whatever you called them, they were the inner circle of one of the most famous lives in the world, and their presence at Graceland was as constant as the white columns on the front porch. The roster shifted over the years, but the core remained fairly stable. Joe Esposito, who served as Elvis's road manager and closest operational aide for 17 years, handling everything from money to travel to logistics. Charlie Hodge, who harmonized with Elvis on stage, handed him scarves and water during concerts, and had an almost musical ESP with his employer Lamar Fike, the jokester, the loudest voice in any room, who had been with Elvis since 1955. Jerry Schilling, younger than the others, sharp and observant Sonny West, who handled the cars, the Motorcycles, the advanced security work on tour, and Red West, Sonny's cousin, who had been with Elvis longer than almost anyone else in the world. These men gave up the conventional architecture of their lives to orbit someone else's. They were paid, but not well, $500 a week in the 1960s, rising to around $425 by the late 1970s. What they received beyond that salary were gifts, cars, houses, clothes, and the extraordinary, intoxicating experience of being at the center of one of the great fame stories in human history. They traveled the world. They were in the room when history happened. They were there for the moments that never made it into any official biography. And they were loyal, with the complicated, profound, sometimes painful loyalty of men who had chosen a person over a career. Several of them had been arrested carrying false prescriptions to collect drugs for Elvis as his addiction deepened in the 1970s. Several had taken physical blows in the service of protecting him. None of them were paid enough for any of it, in any currency. Red West had known Elvis the longest. They had met at Humes High School in Memphis when Elvis was still nobody in particular, just a strange, beautiful kid from the housing projects with a haircut nobody else had and a quality of presence that made people turn and look. Red had been a year behind him, an all-Memphis football player, a tough kid who had grown up hard in the Hurt housing project. The story that gets told consistently is that Red was there in the early days when other boys at school tried to push Elvis around, and Red made sure they didn't. That act of loyalty was the foundation of a relationship that lasted over 20 years. Red West. The immovable object. To understand the legend of what happened at Graceland, and to understand why it resonates so deeply even as a story that may be apocryphal, you have to understand exactly who Red West was and what he represented. He was not simply a large man who happened to work for a famous person. He was a genuinely formidable human being in every sense of the word, and his physical presence was only the most obvious part of it. Red West played football for Memphis, both at Humes High School, where he was All-City, and later at Jones County Junior College. He competed in the Golden Gloves, the amateur boxing tournament that has produced more professional champions than almost any other competition in American history. He served in the United States Marine Corps from 1956 to late 1958, stationed at Norfolk, Virginia. The Marines in that era did not produce men who were physically soft or mentally fragile. You came out of Marine Corps service knowing how to handle yourself, and Red had arrived already knowing considerably more than most. When Elvis was discharged from the Army in 1960, Red went to work for him immediately as a bodyguard, driver, and security chief. The 2 decades that followed were an education in real-world violence that no martial arts school could replicate. Think about what Elvis Presley's life actually looked like from the outside. He was not merely famous, he was the most famous entertainer in the world, the kind of celebrity that generated a specific type of hysteria wherever he appeared. The threats were constant. Death threats arrived weekly at Graceland and at the Colonel's office. Overzealous fans climbed fences, breached backstage areas, rushed the stage. There were promoters with organized crime connections who needed to be managed. There were drunks in bars who took offense at the sight of Elvis's men. There were stalkers, obsessives, true believers who had convinced themselves of a relationship that didn't exist. There were men who simply wanted to prove something by taking a swing at someone famous, or at someone who worked for someone famous. Red dealt with all of it. Every category of human threat that exists, Red West had faced somewhere over those 20 years. He had been in confrontations with men who were bigger than him, with men who were armed, with multiple opponents simultaneously. He had removed people from concerts physically, which at Elvis shows in the early years could be a genuinely dangerous proposition. He had handled situations in which the wrong decision in a fraction of a second could have meant Elvis's life. And through all of it, Red West had never lost. Not once. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect, it is what the historical record supports, and it is what the people who knew him consistently said about him. Red was not a technically trained martial artist. He knew some karate from his years around Elvis's training sessions, and Elvis had arranged for him to study periodically with various instructors. But his fundamental approach to physical conflict was rooted in something simpler and, in his experience, entirely sufficient. Size, strength, and the willingness to use them without hesitation. At what most sources describe as a heavily built, powerful frame, the source story places him at 340 pounds, though this may be somewhat dramatized. Red outweighed most men he encountered by a significant margin. When you are that much bigger than your opponent, and when you have the experience and the nerve to close the distance and use your body as a weapon, the outcome of most physical confrontations is not truly in question. Red West understood fighting the way a carpenter understands a nail. You put the right tool in the right place with enough force behind it, and the problem is solved. There was nothing wrong with this understanding. It had served him, and it had served Elvis, for 20 years without failure. What Red had never encountered, not in any of those 20 years of real-world confrontations, was someone who had spent a lifetime studying what happened in the fractions of a second between intention and action. Someone who had mapped the human body's vulnerabilities the way a surgeon maps the body before an operation. Someone who had turned the act of redirecting force into something approaching an art form. That kind of opponent requires a completely different set of assumptions. And Red West, in the version of events this legend describes, walked into that confrontation carrying 20 years of assumptions that were about to be tested for the first time. Bruce Lee in 1970. The man, the method, the living philosophy. In 1970, Bruce Lee was 30 years old, and he was in a state of transition that would define the last 3 years of his life. He was not yet the global superstar he would become in 1973 with Enter the Dragon and the explosion of martial arts cinema that followed his death. He was known to the American martial arts community, deeply respected among practitioners and aficionados. He had demonstrated at the 1964 Long Beach International Karate Championships, invited by Ed Parker, the very same Ed Parker who trained Elvis Presley, and what he showed that day had electrocuted every serious martial artist in the room. A celebrity hairstylist in attendance named Jay Sebring was so stunned that he obtained a film of Lee's demonstration and showed it to a television producer named William Dozier. Dozier cast Lee as Kato in The Green Hornet. The show ran from 1966 to 1967, and while it was not a massive hit, it introduced Bruce Lee to a generation of American viewers who had never seen anything quite like him. By 1970, The Green Hornet was behind him. He had opened martial arts schools in Seattle, Oakland, and Los Angeles, training students who included actors Chuck Norris and Steve McQueen, basketball legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and screenwriter Sterling Siliphant. He was deep in the development of his martial philosophy, a system he had named Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, which he had formally named in 1967. What Bruce Lee was doing with Jeet Kune Do was genuinely revolutionary in its time, and it remains influential today. He had come to martial arts through Wing Chun, a Chinese system with a history stretching back centuries, that he had studied from 1953 onward under the legendary Grandmaster IP Man in Hong Kong. Wing Chun is a close-range system built on economy of motion and efficiency of force, no wasted movement, no decorative technique, every action designed to achieve a specific mechanical outcome in the shortest possible time. The sticky hands practice of Wing Chun Chi Sao trains the practitioner to feel and redirect force rather than oppose it, to use sensitivity rather than strength. From this foundation, Bruce Lee had gone further. He studied boxing with an intensity that surprised people who assumed traditional martial artists would dismiss Western combat sports. He analyzed Muhammad Ali's footwork obsessively, incorporating its fluid evasion into his own movement. He studied fencing, specifically the concept of stop hitting, intercepting an attack before it fully develops, and built that principle into the core of Jeet Kune Do. He trained his body with scientific rigor. Weight training, running, stretching, isometric exercises, nutritional discipline at a time when most martial artists paid relatively little attention to any of these things. At 5 feet 7 inches and approximately 140 pounds, Bruce Lee was not physically imposing by any conventional measure. What he had done was optimize a body of that size to function at a level that body had no business functioning at. He had measured his reaction time. He had tested his striking speed. He had studied the physics of force generation and applied those physics to his own technique. He performed one-finger push-ups and two-finger push-ups as party tricks, but they weren't party tricks, they were the visible results of a training regimen that treated strength as a byproduct of correct movement rather than an end in itself. And perhaps most importantly, Bruce Lee had moved beyond the mechanics entirely. The philosophical dimension of what he was building was, in some ways, the most radical part of it. He had arrived at an understanding drawn from Taoism, from Zen Buddhism, from his study of philosophy at the University of Washington, that the best fighting system is one that has no system. That fixed patterns, however elegantly designed, contain their own vulnerabilities because they are predictable. He used water as his central metaphor. Water doesn't fight its way around a rock. It simply flows, finding the path of least resistance, adapting to whatever container it finds itself in, never rigid, never resistible, never quite where you expected it to be. He told his students, "Absorb what is useful, discard what is useless, add what is specifically your own." What this meant in practical terms, and here is where the legend of the Graceland encounter becomes genuinely interesting even as a story, is that Bruce Lee had spent 17 years understanding precisely what happens when a large, strong, aggressive person attacks a smaller target. He had mapped the geometry of attack. He knew that when a big man reaches for you, his center of gravity shifts forward in a specific, predictable way. He knew that you don't need to stop that mass, you can redirect it with a fraction of the force it would take to oppose it head-on. He knew that the solar plexus, that cluster of nerves below the sternum, is a target that belongs to no weight class. It doesn't matter how much you bench press. If someone who knows exactly what they're doing lands a precise strike in that exact location, the body's nervous system overrides every other command, and for the following 10 to 15 seconds, you are not in control of what your body does. That knowledge, not strength, not size, not years of experience measured in victories, is what the legend of this encounter is really about. Two worlds, one room. The atmosphere of Graceland lets set the scene the way it deserves to be set, because the physical context matters. Graceland in 1970 was a mansion on 13.8 acres in the Whitehaven neighborhood of Memphis, Tennessee, purchased by Elvis in 1957 for $102,500 when he was 22 years old. The building itself was a colonial revival structure, white columns, limestone facade, wrought iron gates that Elvis had installed with a design featuring a guitar strumming figure against a staff of musical notes. It was, by 1970, one of the most recognizable private homes in America. Inside, Graceland wore the aesthetic of its era with absolute commitment. The living room featured thick white carpet that swallowed sound. There were gold records on the walls and frames, rows of them stretching floor to ceiling, each one a monument to the kind of commercial success that most artists never approach in a lifetime of work. Velvet furniture in deep blues and golds sat in conversational groupings. A grand piano occupied its corner, white, naturally, and crystal chandeliers threw warm light across everything. The whole effect was opulent in a specifically 1970s American way, a long way from Tupelo, Mississippi, which was entirely the point. This was the room where the Memphis Mafia gathered, where Elvis held court, where decisions were made and evenings were passed and the machine that was Elvis Presley's career was maintained and tended to. It was a room that had seen extraordinary things, musicians dropping in, film producers making offers, politicians seeking photo opportunities, friends from childhood coming to see what the kid from the housing project had built for himself. It was not a room that surprised easily. In the legend, Bruce Lee arrives not as a stranger but as an invited guest. The connection that makes his presence plausible is entirely real. Ed Parker, Elvis's own instructor, had been the man who brought Bruce Lee to national attention in 1964 by inviting him to demonstrate at the Long Beach International Karate Championships. Parker was both men's connection to the martial arts world. Whether or not the two men ever actually sat across from each other in Graceland's living room, they inhabited a world that was small enough that such an encounter was not remotely impossible. In the story as it's told, the Memphis Mafia watches Bruce with a range of responses. Joe Esposito, practical and watchful, looks on with genuine curiosity. Jerry Schilling takes the mental notes of a man who wants to understand everything. Lamar Fike, who normally could find something funny about any situation, has gone unusually quiet. And Red West stands at the doorway to the kitchen with his arms crossed and his jaw set in his 20 years of experience telling him something he can't quite articulate yet, that something doesn't add up about this small, quiet man who moves like water and seems completely unaware of how outmatched he should be. The tension in the room, as the legend tells it, is not hostility. It's the specific discomfort of a worldview being challenged before anyone has said anything overtly challenging. Red has kept Elvis safe for 2 decades. The methods he has used have worked. And now Elvis is sitting there hanging on every word of a man who weighs barely more than 140 pounds, asking questions about the philosophy of combat with the reverence of a student at the feet of a master, and something in Red West does not sit right with any of it. 11 seconds. What the physics actually say whether or not the confrontation happened the way the legend describes it, the underlying physics are real, and they're worth understanding in full. Because the story of a 140-pound man putting a 340-pound man on the floor in 11 seconds is not fantasy, it is a description of what correctly applied biomechanics can achieve against even the most physically imposing opponent. Bruce Lee's system, Jeet Kune Do, drew from Wing Chun the concept of using an opponent's attack against them rather than opposing it with countering force. This is a principle that runs through multiple Asian martial traditions, and its roots are in observations about physics that predate modern science by centuries. When a large, strong person initiates a grab or an attack with forward momentum, they commit their center of gravity in a specific direction. In the fraction of a second that commitment is made and before they can reverse it, they are momentarily vulnerable in ways they can't easily compensate for. You do not need to stop that mass. You need only redirect it by a few degrees, just enough to take the attacker's center line offline while simultaneously placing your own strike on the most vulnerable available target. The force required to redirect rather than oppose is dramatically less. This is not philosophy. It is applied physics. The solar plexus, the celiac plexus, more precisely, is a dense network of nerve fibers located just below the sternum, in the upper abdomen. It is the junction point of multiple major nerve pathways that regulate the diaphragm and the breathing muscles. A sudden, precise impact to this area can trigger an involuntary diaphragmatic spasm, commonly called having the wind knocked out, that temporarily interrupts the body's ability to breathe regardless of the victim's size, fitness level, or mental determination. The nervous system's response is not a decision. It happens whether you want it to or not. A 340-pound man whose diaphragm is in spasm cannot breathe. His lungs are fighting to expand and being refused by muscles that have temporarily stopped responding to neurological commands. He cannot think his way out of this. He cannot will it away. For the following 10 to 15 seconds, his body is engaged in a crisis that has nothing to do with strength or experience or the outcome of previous fights. The legend describes the motion this way. Bruce steps not backward but forward, into Red's reaching hands, meeting the attack rather than retreating from it. His left hand intercepts Red's right wrist at the moment of maximum forward commitment, not grabbing, not opposing, just a redirection requiring almost no force of its own. The touch deflects the attack by inches. Simultaneously, the right hand delivers a palm strike to the solar plexus. Precise. Sharp. Targeted. Red West hits the white carpet. 11 seconds from the moment of first contact to the moment 340 pounds of experienced Bodyguard is lying on his side, gasping, completely unable to understand what just happened to his body. This is what Jeet Kune Do describes as the principle of interception, meeting the attack at the earliest possible moment, at the point where the attacker is most committed and least able to change course. Bruce Lee had distilled this principle from Wing Chun, refined it through his study of fencing's stop-hit concept, and practiced it until the movement was instantaneous and automatic. He had written about it extensively. He had taught it to his students. The execution in the legend is not supernatural. It is the result of a man who had spent 17 years perfecting a single fundamental truth about how bodies move when they attack. Size matters. Weight matters. Strength matters. Bruce Lee always said this, it was part of his philosophy's honesty. But they are tools, not guarantors. Precision matters more. Timing matters more. And the understanding that a larger opponent's size is as much a liability as an asset, because more mass means more committed momentum, means less ability to change direction mid-attack, that understanding is something you can study your way to. Red West, in the legend, has never encountered this before. He has fought bigger men, armed men, multiple opponents. He has never fought someone who understood the geometry of his attack better than he did. The lesson that changed everything. Aftermath in the living room in the story, what follows the 11 seconds is almost as interesting as the 11 seconds themselves. Bruce Lee doesn't stand over Red West with any expression that could be read as triumph. He kneels beside him. He tells him to breathe slowly, that the spasm will pass, that he's not injured. When Red's lungs finally obey and the color returns to his face, Bruce helps him to his feet, a physical impossibility by simple arithmetic, 140 pounds assisting 340, but correct body mechanics and positioning make it work just fine, which is itself a small additional lesson. He explains precisely what happened. The wrist deflection. The solar plexus target. The diaphragm spasm. He gives Red the full technical breakdown while Red is still processing the fact of being on the floor. This is also entirely consistent with everything documented about Bruce Lee as a teacher. His students, from Chuck Norris to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to Sterling Siliphant, uniformly describe a man who taught with generosity and precision, who wanted people to understand the why of every technique, not merely the how. He had developed a philosophy that explicitly rejected secrecy in martial arts. Absorbed what is useful. The knowledge was only valuable if it was shared and applied. Red West's response in the legend is the most satisfying part of the story, and it rings true to what the historical record tells us about his character. He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't minimize what happened. He tells Elvis directly, "Whatever this man charges, pay double. This is real." He extends his hand to Bruce and apologizes, not for challenging him but for the specific assumption he had carried into the room, that size was everything. And he asks Bruce to teach him. This is the transformation the story is really about. Red West wasn't wrong to value size and strength. They had served him in 20 years of genuine danger, genuine service to a man he genuinely cared about. What he had been was incomplete. There was an entire dimension of combat that he had never explored, because he had never needed to. He had one without it. Now he knew what he hadn't known. Now he understood that his protection of Elvis, which was the thing he cared about most in his professional life, could be better. Not because what he had done before was wrong, but because there was more to add to it. Precision. Timing. The understanding of the body's vulnerabilities that turned conflict from a test of size into a test of knowledge. Whether or not this specific moment occurred exactly this way, Red West's documented history includes a period in the early 1970s during which Elvis arranged extensive martial arts training for members of his security team. He was committed to upgrading the capabilities of the men around him. The trajectory of the legend is consistent with the documented trajectory of the real lives involved. Two kings who never shared a stage. The real historical record here is what the historical record actually confirms about the relationship between Elvis Presley and Bruce Lee, and it is genuinely extraordinary even without any undocumented encounter at Graceland. The connection between them runs through a single man. Ed Parker. Ed Parker invited Bruce Lee to demonstrate at the first International Karate Championships in Long Beach, California in August of 1964. That demonstration, in front of an audience that included a celebrity hairstylist named Jay Sebring, was the event that launched Bruce Lee's career in America. Sebring obtained a film of the demonstration, showed it to television producer William Dozier, and Dozier cast Lee as Kato in The Green Hornet. Without Ed Parker's invitation to that 1964 tournament, there may have been no Green Hornet, no Enter the Dragon, no Bruce Lee legend as the world came to know it. Ed Parker was also Elvis Presley's primary martial arts instructor and personal friend for the last 2 decades of Elvis's life. He served as one of Elvis's bodyguards during his concert tours of the 1970s, traveled with him, trained him, promoted him through multiple degrees of black belt. He knew both men as well as anyone in the world knew either of them. This means that Bruce Lee and Elvis Presley were separated by exactly one person. They inhabited overlapping worlds, shared the same trusted advisor, moved through the same spaces of American celebrity and martial arts culture in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The encounter that the legend describes is geographically and socially plausible in a way that gives it its persistent life. It is the story of a meeting that could have happened, and that both men would, based on everything we know about them, have found genuinely interesting. Elvis reportedly made multiple attempts to arrange a meeting with Bruce Lee in the early 1970s. By most accounts, Bruce was in Hong Kong when the first requests came through, consumed with the film projects that would make him an international superstar. When Elvis finally reached out again with real urgency, the message that came back was devastating. Bruce Lee had died on July 20, 1973, at the age of 32. Elvis was reportedly deeply saddened by the news. Here was a man he had genuinely wanted to meet, a conversation about martial arts he had genuinely wanted to have, and the window had closed without warning. 2 years after Bruce Lee's death, Elvis's own health began its irreversible decline. He died at Graceland on August 16, 1977, at the age of 42. They were separated in death by barely 4 years. The story of what these two might have discussed, might have demonstrated, might have learned from each other, that's the story that lives in the legend. And it is a genuinely poignant one, because both men were, at their cores, the same kind of person. Someone who found a discipline that consumed them, who pursued mastery with a ferocity that most people never apply to anything, who believed that the body and the mind could be trained to do extraordinary things if you were willing to put in the time and the honest work. Red West, the man at the center of this legend, outlived both of them. He continued working for Elvis until 1976, when he and Sonny West and Dave Hebler were fired by Elvis's father Vernon, officially a cost-cutting measure, unofficially a response to the Bodyguard's increasing alarm about Elvis's drug use and their willingness to say so. Red and Sonny and Dave Hebler published a book about their years with Elvis, Elvis. What Happened, in August of 1977, 2 weeks before Elvis died. Red carried that timing for the rest of his life. He died in Memphis on July 18, 2017, at the age of 81, 2 months after his cousin Sonny. A Marine, a Golden Gloves boxer, a songwriter, an actor, a stuntman, and for 20 years the man between Elvis Presley and the world. A man who, in the version of events that has passed into legend, was put on the floor by a 140-pound martial artist in 11 seconds, and had the character to stand up, extend his hand, and ask to learn more. Legacy. What these men left behind, the reason this story lives, the reason you are watching this video right now, is not really about a confrontation on a white carpet in 1970. It's about what both men represented, and what happens when two fundamentally different philosophies of human capability come into contact with each other. Red West represented something real and valuable. The proposition that experience matters, that preparation matters, that 2 decades of doing something in the real world against real opponents builds a competence that no amount of theory can replace. He was right about this. He had protected a man for 20 years without a catastrophic failure. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Bruce Lee represented something equally real. The proposition that knowledge matters, that precision matters, that the human body is a machine whose vulnerabilities and capabilities can be mapped and studied and exploited through intelligence rather than simply overwhelmed through force. He had spent his adult life proving this. He had shown that a body of 140 pounds, operating with the right information and the right training, could do things that seemed impossible to observers operating on conventional assumptions about how fights work. The thing that makes this legend worth telling is that neither man is wrong. They are both right. The most complete version of human physical capability combines both experience and knowledge, force and precision, the willingness to absorb punishment and keep moving forward along with the understanding of exactly where to put the strike that ends things quickly. Red West in the legend comes out of the encounter not defeated but enlarged. He knows more than he did 11 seconds ago. What he knew before was not discarded, it was supplemented, made more complete. Bruce Lee spent his career trying to communicate this. Not that traditional martial arts were wrong. Not that size and strength were irrelevant. But that they were part of a larger truth, and the larger truth was worth pursuing. He wrote in his notes, "Using no way is way, having no limitation is limitation." He meant that the practitioner who refuses to be defined by a single system or a single set of assumptions is the most complete practitioner. Red West, in 11 seconds on white carpet, learned this firsthand. Elvis Presley spent the last 2 decades of his life pursuing exactly this kind of completeness in his own body, training across multiple systems, earning ranks under multiple instructors, incorporating martial arts into his performances and his daily life and his conception of himself. He wore a custom training uniform with his TCB lightning bolt. He wrote personal oaths about discipline and spirit on his private plane. He was not merely collecting black belts. He was genuinely trying to understand something. The three of them, Elvis, Red, Bruce, were men who believed that the body was worth taking seriously, that physical discipline was a form of self-knowledge, that what you could do with your hands and your feet and your mind in the moment of genuine crisis said something real and important about who you were. All three of them are gone now. The white carpet is long since cleaned and the living room at Graceland is roped off for tourists. But the question they asked, whether size is enough, whether experience is enough, whether knowledge can overcome force, that question is still alive. Every martial arts gym, every competition, every training session between a large person and a small one is asking some version of it. The legend says Bruce Lee answered it in 11 seconds. The history says these two men probably never met. The truth is that both things can be simultaneously real, because the legend doesn't need to have happened to contain something true. What it contains is a demonstration of a principle that Bruce Lee spent his life refining and writing about and teaching. That the most powerful force in any confrontation is understanding. Not size. Not strength. Not experience alone. Understanding. If you want to keep exploring stories like this one, the legends at the edges of history, the moments where extraordinary people collided, the principles that hold up whether or not any particular story is literally true, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. And if this video gave you something to think about, drop a comment below. Tell me which of these three men you'd most want to sit down and talk to for an hour, and what you'd ask them. I read every single one. Until next time.